Hi, I'm Nikolai, aka 56 Miner, and today we'll be unboxing our June Basics box. This box is all about hand lettering. We'll talk about some fundamentals of the art form, showcase what materials in our box are good for what styles, and I'll share some tips and tricks that I picked up. Let's get into it. Our first item is going to be a set of twin brush markers from Monomi. I really love these markers because they're very versatile, and because they're water soluble, you can do a lot with them. Our surface this month is going to be the Paint On Pad from Clairefontaine. This bright white mixed media paper is great for a lot of mediums and allows you to really build color. If you've watched any of our videos before, you know that I always suggest swatching out your materials. Here I've gone ahead and swatched out our markers, and thanks to that bright white of that Paint On Pad, we really don't have to worry about those colors changing on the paper. Each of our Monomi markers come with two brush nibs. The first is going to be a slightly thicker brush that allows for more dynamic marks and lines that have a lot of line weight variance to them. And the other is going to be kind of thinner and just a little bit stiffer. This will allow us to create more consistent lines with less of that line weight variance, and are also just good for detailing. By applying a lot of pressure, we can still get those thick to thin marks, but the brush tip is going to be a little bit less sensitive than the larger one. The gray marker in this set has a special place as it's going to allow us to darken those colors a lot more. By layering the gray over our lighter colors, we can see that it kind of overwhelms it a bit, but once we get into those middle values with the blue and the purple, it's a great tool in order to add just a little bit more of a three-dimensional and subtle effect. When it comes to blending colors together, the great part about these markers is that they're all water soluble, so they blend really easily. We can achieve gradients by overlaying the two markers, and you can actually smooth out these colors even more by adding a little bit of water. You can create more three-dimensional objects with these markers by being intentional of the light and shadow. Here I'm using that gray in order to darken up the shadow side of this sphere and to add a cast shadow. It's a very subtle technique, but you can tell that it adds a lot of three-dimensionality. We can also use these markers to create subtle washes. Here I'll use the purple and the brush that we shipped in our January box in order to fan out that color. Because these markers are water soluble, we can make these really nice subtle washes just by diluting them with water. This is a great technique to work if you're fond of gradients, or if you just want to fill in a background. Now that we've gotten to know our markers a little bit more, let's talk about some fundamentals of hand lettering. I'm going to be using a larger piece of paper just so I can keep everything on screen, but these fundamentals really apply to any surface. We're going to start with the two foundational components of hand lettering, upstrokes and downstrokes. Now, downstrokes are always going to create a thicker, darker line due to the fact that we're pushing that marker into the surface. Upstrokes, by contrast, will be a little bit thinner because we're going to be pulling that marker up. It's going to be dragging that brush tip against the surface, which will result in a thinner line. Let's use the word hello to demonstrate this in action. So we're going to push down on that H, pull up on that hump, and then push back down. This creates a lot of line weight variance, which is typical of hand lettering. Hello is a great practice word for this, as those E's and L's and O's all have that kind of loopy characteristic. Hand lettering is one of those art forms that you really have to take your time with and go slow in order to get the smoothest line. You can also go in with that smaller brush nib and clean up some edges or add some embellishments. It's really important with hand lettering to be conscious of your strokes. Here I'm going to take a fine liner and kind of outline those downstrokes and upstrokes, and by breaking down those letters into smaller strokes, you can be more conscious of your line weight and get some fun effects. While there's some common styles in hand lettering, a lot of the fun is creating your own. You can take inspiration from your everyday handwriting, start to look at it a little bit differently, and in terms of downstrokes and upstrokes, you'll be able to create some really fun, unique hand lettering. I really enjoy block hand lettering, which is typical of like capitals, so we can achieve a style like this by keeping the brush horizontal and not changing the angle at which it meets the paper. This allows us to make a consistent line weight, and that marker actually gives us a little bit of a gradient. I also really like drop shadows. We can add a drop shadow by adding a line to the left of all of our downstrokes, and this just makes it pop a little bit more. There are a lot of terms used in hand lettering, so I want to introduce a few to you. The first is going to be X height, So that's going to be the average height of your letters. So as you can see, all of these letters have the same X height. Anything that goes above that line is going to be an ascender, and anything that goes below that line is going to be a descender. A lowercase y has a descender on the tail. The next term is called a median. The horizontal line on my H and my E falls on the median. Lowercase letters typically end at the median, and it's just good to be conscious of so that you can have consistency in your lettering. There's infinite possibilities with hand lettering. By keeping these foundations in mind, you kind of give yourself some parameters to make consistent letters. Once you have your letters down, you can start to add embellishments and gradients that kind of make them look more elevated. If you're a fan of color gradients, definitely try using a wet brush to smooth out those transitions. Our next item is going to be the Color Real brush from Monomi in the color Peacock Green. Before we can use this brush pen, we will need to activate it. So make sure to twist the top and the bottom portions together enough to pierce that barrel of the ink. But make sure not to squeeze the barrel or ink can drip out. Let's take a sheet of our paint on pad and use our practice word, hello, to demonstrate the differences of this brush. In order to get those smooth lines, you want to make sure to move really slow when using this brush pen. That'll allow the ink to go into the paper. By using a little bit more pressure on our downstrokes, we can get that characteristic thick to thin line that you see so often in brush lettering. Some of my downstrokes came out a little bit thinner than on the H, so I'm going to go back in and thicken those up. We can embellish those downstrokes even more by going back over and darkening them up a bit. This creates a really fun gradient effect that you typically see in the markers. It's very similar to the ribbon effect that we saw back in March when we shipped the illustration marker box. Because the brush tip is so flexible, this can be kind of tricky if you're starting out, so make sure to be patient with yourself and practice. Our next marker is going to be the Le Plume 2 in brown. These markers have a similar brush tip to the Monomi, but they also include a fine tip. The fine tip on this marker will allow us to make consistent lines that don't have any line variance to them, which is great for a more cursive looking hand lettering. For this style, we're going to have really wide spacing between the letters, and if you're like me and you use your wrist as a stabilizer on the table, you might find it easier to pause and move your hand so you can get consistent spacing. Let's use the brush tip side of our Le Plume marker to emphasize those downstrokes. This will help it stand off from the page a little bit more. This style is sometimes called faux calligraphy because you're going in post to add that line weight. It's a really simple but elegant hand lettering style. Now that we have a good understanding of our materials and some of the foundations, let's do something a little bit more complex. Let's hand letter the phrase live more, create more. It'll give us a chance to practice more letters, and it's a good motto as creatives. Sometimes we just need to take a break and recharge those batteries. Sometimes it's easier to start with words that necessarily aren't the first one. By focusing on the downstrokes, I can make sure that my letters are a consistent width, and by starting with word more, I can use it to base all my other hand lettering off of it, as it's a 4-letter word and centers really well. Using the smaller nib on our Monomi brush, I'm going to go in and clean up some edges and add a gradient effect. With my letters cleaned up, I'll go in and add a few embellishments to it. I really like embellishments as they're just kind of a fun way to make the words stand out more. Let's grab the last item in our box, the Fudebiyori Brush Pen from Kuretake Zig. This white pigment paint pen is great for embellishments and highlights, and comes with a similar nib to the Monomi brush pen set. Let's use this to push that gradient on our lettering even further. By layering the paint pen and letting those layers dry in between application, we can make that white even more opaque. If you ever feel that there's pigment buildup on the nib, you can wipe off that pigment on a spare sheet of paper. If you have any black or dark colored paper, I definitely suggest giving hand lettering with this tool a shot. Let's grab our Le Plume and do the word live. Here I'm going to go in and overlay it just on the top. First going in with the fine liner side and taking my time as I roll through those letters, and then coming back in with the brush side to thicken it up and create that kind of faux calligraphy look. Let's use that fine liner side to kind of make some Art Nouveau embellishments. We can add a few simple lines for a shine embellishment, And then to create a border, I'll actually use a sheet from our pad and use that machine cut edge as a ruler guideline. Art Nouveau is all about geometric shapes and clear, bold visual elements. Let's add some dots to the corner and maybe a little flower detail as well. Next we have the word create. Let's go in with our Monomi brush and hand letter that word, making sure that we're taking a slow and steady pace. This will allow the ink to flow to the bristles and onto our surface so that we get nice clean lines. Next I'll go in and darken up the tops of those letters. I really love how this ink pen creates those nice subtle gradients. Always make sure to cross your T's and dot your I's. Here I'll add a little bit of a bend to that crossbar just to make it look cohesive. For our embellishments, I'll go in and add a few movement lines, really just using the tip of that brush pen. For our second more, I'm going to do something similar to the first one, but let's thicken up those letters a little bit. With these brush nibs, a good rule of thumb is that consistent hand pressure will always make a more consistent line. Don't worry though if your lines aren't consistent, you can always go in with that smaller nib like I am to thicken up those edges and just clean things up a bit. For our embellishments, let's create some shine marks and do a few dots so it kind of looks like a night sky. Going in with our white brush pen, we can create a three-dimensional effect by making little dots and shine lines on our letters. And remember, the more you layer that pen, the more opaque that white is going to be. And with that, our piece is complete. Hope you enjoyed the video, learned a few things, and if you post your work online, make sure you use #SketchBoxJune. We love to see what y'all create each month, and I'll see you next month.